Right, thank you very much. In a sense, it's a slightly awkward time for the National Audit Office around the procurement reform agenda. We're in the middle of two quite big pieces of work, which will end up as reports to Parliament, either right at the end of this year or early in the next year, really analysing different aspects of the procurement reform programme that Sally Polly was talking about early on. So we're kind of in the middle of quite a big piece of research and analysis around that programme. So it's quite difficult for me at the moment. I'm not going to be kind of presenting any critical analysis at this time on that programme. We'll come forward with that kind of towards the end of the year and early next year. What I can do though, and what I thought would be useful, is just to kind of stand back a little bit from the here and now of the kind of issues that are sort of being discussed right now and that we're right in the middle of it. Just put it in the context of the NAO work over time on procurement and what the NAO drawing out issues from NAO work over time on procurement, because it's always been a really big feature of our work. I also want to talk a little bit, it might be useful to kind of leave you with a little bit of information about exactly what are the issues we're looking at, how do we see, how are we framing the issues right now to kind of whet your appetites. That's the stuff that we're going to be presenting over the next few months' time. Right, hello oversight on the office way. Yeah. So, I mean, I put this slide in the package up front just to kind of emphasise really why it's really important to NAO to have a lot of coverage of different aspects of procurement in our work programme. The spend on procurement of assets and goods and services through third parties, that 32%, it is a massive, massive slug of public expenditure overall. So therefore for us, within that, there are lots of really interesting, really important value for money questions. How that spend is managed is bound to be a key factor in whether government overall gets good value for money from taxpayers' money. So that's why it always gets quite a decent amount of NAO attention. I mean, within that, we could break that down in hundreds of different ways. That 32%, that includes spend through, traditional commercial sector organisations, through voluntary sector bodies, through joint ventures, through mutuals. It'll include standard, more traditional kind of time and materials kind of contracts. It will include more innovative kind of contractual arrangements around payment by results. Clearly it includes spend across all of the different sectors, central, local and the NHS. So a whole diversity of things in there, also from very complex procurements, perhaps one-off procurements associated with a big project, maybe something like universal credit, massive procurements associated with that, through to procurement of routine, standard commodity items that everyone is buying, whether it's paper, stationery, etc. So massive diversity of things in there. Just to talk a little bit from different perspectives and thinking about different ways of cutting it, the different issues and the different work that NAO has done over recently. And so the first way of cutting it is just by the procurement cycle. So this slide just tries to cut the work that we've done by that cycle to illustrate the things that we've done. Now, most of the work we've done actually doesn't fit neatly into one phase of the procurement cycle, but it might have had a bit more emphasis on one aspect, or the conclusions might have ended up having a focus on one aspect a little bit more than another. I'm not going through these one by one, but you can see on the slide the diversity of things that are in here. It really is a diversity. It's from kind of the procurement of routine consumables in the NHS to, in the middle column, the first item, you'll see that we did something on the commissioning of basically soap opera in the BBC. So quite a big diversity, quite a big range of territory. This work has taken us into quite a spectrum of stuff. And then big things like M25 is in there, then more routine things again, prison service, just picking up bits and pieces. We've done a lot of stuff recently on the Olympics, predictably. There's an ongoing, Ministry of Defence is clearly one of the public sector's biggest procurers. There's ongoing interest and portfolio of work that's covering there. There's even on the right-hand side government procurement cards. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, picking up on some of the previous things. Well, in fact, right now. So this slide kind of picks out, some of our work will take a sector-specific basis. It will look at procurement in transport sector and the health sector. Sometimes it will just look at procurement in the context of one particular project. Sometimes we'll look across the piece and we'll look across the whole of government at how an aspect of procurement. And on this slide are examples of the work, of the cross-cutting work that we've done, and I'll try and just pick out some of the issues that have come out in the main headlines that have come out of some of these reports. So starting actually with the government procurement card report, I think we published that towards the end of last year, partly on the back of the fact that there had been a bit of a media frenzy around the idea of public sector workers, civil servants having pieces of plastic in their pockets that they could allegedly go and do what they wished with. And journalists had a field day kind of finding what they perceived to be inappropriate uses of these cards. I mean, the issues that came out of our report were, certainly we supported the principle of the use of the cards. It's not a panacea, it's not always going to be the answer. There is definitely, I definitely agree with the MasterCard speaker who was talking about, really there is a need for better understanding of the value for money case for using the cards. We found that was lacking. There wasn't therefore a sound basis for public sector organisations to make a good evidence-based decision on which route to go down and whether to use the procurement card, but certainly to have that in the suite of procurement mechanisms, absolutely it should be there. We did a bit of illustrative work actually. We didn't try to, we were aware of £28 and these sort of figures that were being bandied around. We didn't try and do a comprehensive piece, and really, within government that needs to be done partly in the context of individual bodies and then maybe for government as a whole. We just did some illustrative work with one government department, with the Ministry of Justice, in their context, switching spend to the procurement card route. We reckon that probably saved them about £5 a transaction, but that was very illustrative, and those circumstances may well not be replicated elsewhere. We did talk, a focus of the work is very much the control environment around the government procurement card because of the agenda at the time. We certainly did find that in some cases there were weak and inconsistent controls, and that the control environment probably did need to be tightened up in some areas. What could be done there? We certainly didn't think the solution was to say, oh, it's all too difficult and we just won't bother using the card, because we do intuitively and with some evidence believe that there are benefits to using it. So just sweeping down some of the others, I've dwelt on that in a little bit more detail given it's been discussed already this morning, just to give you a bit of a flavour of some of these others. The work on, the next one down on the Efficiency and Reform Group is a new organisation that Sally spoke about. Really that was quite a forward-looking piece to try and set out very early in the life of this new entity that was within government, what its agenda was, what its ambitions were. It wasn't intended to be a particularly critical piece. The next one on collaborative procurement, that I think for us that's probably been the most significant output around the procurement space in recent years. And this really argued, we published this, I'm thinking 3 years ago about that, so pre the current batch of reforms. But it really pointed out that the procurement landscape was a bit of a mess. There were, at that time, there were, for example, 50 different professional buying organisations across the public sector, unclear, overlapping responsibilities, a lot of duplication, a lot of lack of clarity about the landscape and the different organisations around. And that had a number of consequences. Particularly, it meant that central government, the public sector generally, certainly weren't facing off to suppliers with anything like one voice, quite the reverse. There was very, very little effective coordination and joining up around that. We did talk about aggregation of demand. We didn't think that that was working well, even with mechanisms that were intended sometimes to aggregate demand. The framework agreements that were in existence weren't proving to be an effective way of aggregating demand. It was just a mini competition would be run each time by one individual public sector buyer. Now, aggregation of demand is definitely not, again, always the right answer. This needs to be thought through on a category by category basis and looking at the different items within that category. But certainly in some cases, we think there probably is a case for more effective aggregation of demand. Categories like energy spring to mind, but that wasn't necessarily happening effectively. So that was quite a strong call for action, and I think that report by us has been cited quite a lot in the kind of case for change that the incoming government made, and probably has some links to some of the reforms that Sally's been talking about. Commercial skills, the next one, that's been a perennial theme. So this was one particular report where, as well as saying that across the public sector we weren't necessarily sure that the right commercial skills were in place, but even within taking that, there were barriers around the way that commercial skills could be deployed flexibly across the public sector. The incentives, certainly there were good examples of bringing in people into the public sector with really good commercial skills, but then they were being put in an environment where I'm not sure their skills would necessarily be used to best effect, and actually there's then quite a high turnover of these people, which clearly isn't a good thing. And there's also for us been issues around information on skills was a big feature of this report. There wasn't a good understanding of what types of what skills the public sector had and where they sat. And then lastly, the report on management of service contracts was worth drawing out too, I thought, because this, the main thing that came out of this was really to say that contract management just felt like a very neglected area. There was a lot of attention given, a lot of sort of senior management attention would be given to the earlier stages in the procurement cycle. Once contracts were let, it didn't feel like that was the case. Sometimes there might be complete changeover of staff, so a completely different batch of staff would then come in and be handling the relationship with the supplier. No continuity, no understanding of the basis of the contract perhaps. Real overstretch among contract managers we found. We found examples of individuals managing several really large, complex, high-risk projects because the organisation just hadn't recognised the strategic importance of managing the contract. Also, problems around lack of value for money testing of contracts, quite poor performance management information around contracts. That again, that was again 3 or 4 years ago, so that's not completely fresh off the shelves, but I'm interested in people's views on whether that's still the case or whether that will be a harsh judgment now. This I wasn't going to dwell into. I just wanted to, it's in your slide packs, I'll leave it with you. So this is just kind of drawing out some of the major sector-based or project-based reports that we've done that have really raised important issues around procurement. So I won't dwell on these, but this is part of the back catalogue, and I leave this with you. But then to draw sort of this bit together a little bit, what we tried to do, partly we did this for thinking about, well, actually, with this current piece of work that we're doing now, what are the most important issues that we're bringing into this in terms of NAO analysis from the past? And we got it down to these 6 issues. And we're certainly not saying that all of these points necessarily are a completely current analysis. This is not intended to be an analysis of where we are right now in September 2012 in terms of where the public sector as a whole is as a commissioner and as a procurer. It's more a bringing together of a number of issues that we've raised over the last 2 or 3 years collectively. So just starting with information, this has certainly been a key area that's pervaded much of our work around the procurement and the commercial agenda. Just there not being good basic information in place on what are we spending, who are we spending it with, when are contracts coming up for renewal. That information is often not held corporately by, certainly by some of the larger public sector organisations. They haven't traditionally had that at their fingertips. I mean, Sally is right to talk about the drive that John Collington particularly has been starting. There is absolutely a lot of work going on to try to improve this. But then linked to that is, there's a point on information on skills, but then also the point on the slide about option appraisal is that, where you're thinking, and maybe this links to what Sally was saying about thinking about commissioning and procurement. If at the outset we're thinking about what's the user requirement and what is the full range of ways and delivery models and commercial models that we could use to deliver that user requirement, often there isn't actually good analysis and good data to help guide that decision and guide which kind of routes, which delivery model routes to go down. Moving to supplier management, this again, big theme, that this hasn't always been done well, that the public sector hasn't necessarily had really good knowledge of the supplier market, it hasn't necessarily had good market intelligence, it hasn't really invested in building that up. That in some cases we found in the contract management work that really the relationship with the supplier wasn't being managed effectively. There were financial penalties in place that were just being waived even though performance wasn't measuring up to the weaknesses in the performance management regimes. On price, we and others have done various things showing significant price differences for standard goods and services. I mean, that kind of price benchmarking does need to be treated carefully, does need to be looked at intelligently. I suspect people in the room will know better than I the difficulties of doing that accurately and making sure you really are comparing the same things. But it is useful and interesting to do. It does provoke a discussion. It leads to questions being asked where something looks odd, where an organisation looks to be paying too much. Buying power, and I think the price variation will be a product of a number of things, and that will certainly include the failure to aggregate demand where that is appropriate. On process, we have consistently argued that there is unnecessary admin spend around procurement. Clearly that has disadvantages for the public sector buying organisation. It also has disadvantages for the supplier where the process is too long, too drawn out, or actually where it's unnecessary in the first place. As part of one of our pieces of work, we did some analysis of several hundred OG notices, and we reckon that about 1 in 5 of those were unnecessary in the first place because they were already covered by an existing compliant framework somewhere. So there is quite a lot of that suggests there is quite a lot of waste and unnecessary activity in the procurement process. Going around the circle into people is a key aspect inevitably. I talked a little bit about commercial skills in the context of that one report. I mean, some of them, we tried to break it down, and it's a phrase that's used quite widely, commercial skills, and I think lots of people have perhaps slightly varying understandings of exactly what that means. So we tried to kind of break that down into a number of components and say, well, which are the aspects that we think we're most concerned about the public sector's capability in, and we came down to contract management, to the risk management around a contract, and to skills around, we call it business acumen here. And what we mean by that is just really the ability to understand what the supplier is all about, what the supplier's motivations are, and then to be able to negotiate with the supplier from that perspective, that kind of skill. And then also the point here, the point is in here about excessive reliance on interims and advisors. Sorry, I did slip into the package a little bit, a point around this. The landscape has changed quite a lot. As you know, there's a moratorium on the use of consultants, and there's no doubt that the spend on consultants has gone down hugely over the last couple of years, but that also has consequences which need to be managed in the context of the commercial skill base that the public sector has. And then lastly, just coming into the middle around central coordination, I mean, for us, a focus is often what is the role of the Cabinet Office of the Efficiency and Reform Group, the Treasury, around this in working with departments and working with wider public sector bodies. We certainly felt that the point about the landscape being very, very fragmented and messy, the lack of clarity really around some of the governance, around the different bodies involved in procurement across the public sector is a perennial concern. The argument about the consequences that has for buying power and administrative savings. There've been, there's a long history of the kind of relationship between the central organisations, whether it's Office of Government Commerce as was, whether it's Buying Solutions as was. Clearly these are issues now for the Efficiency and Reform Group and for the Government Procurement Service. There is a natural tension between those central bodies and the spending departments in central government and organisations in the wider public sector. And the quality of that engagement hasn't always been right in the past, and certainly the way that the central organisations have tried to engage with the bodies I'm describing hasn't always been managed well. It seems to me that that's an absolutely key priority for the Efficiency and Reform Group now to try to get right. And the last point is that it links to this point about contract management being a neglected area. Sally rightly said, okay, there is piles of guidance on contract management, and I'm sure she's right that that needs some rationalisation. But I think there is also something about that being recognised to be of the strategic importance that it is, and not kind of a neglected, rather undervalued area. Moving on, and checking the audio, checking the time, and running on time, I can conclude relatively quickly from here, I promise. So what I wanted to do was to just move on and give you a quick flavour of the current NAO work programme. This slide puts what we're doing now into the context of some of the other recent work. So a lot of the stuff on the left I've described already because we've published it. And it shows there's different streams. So across the top, that's really the reports that we do for Parliament, and then on a cross-government basis, just under the big blue arrow, there's the sector-based work that we do. As well as that, we do some work for other parts of Parliament. So you see bits and pieces we're doing there for the Public Administration Committee and also for the Environmental Audit Committee. I guess the key things to draw your attention to on this slide, I'm going to talk just briefly on the next slide about the improving government procurement work, which is top right. But just to make you aware of a couple of the other key things that we're currently doing. One is looking a deeper dive into supplier management from the perspective of the ICT suppliers, and looking at how well government is managing the supply chain there. That's certainly taking us a lot into the SME issue. That piece of work is getting into that issue a lot. And then something specifically on police procurement. And the last slide then is just a little bit more detail on how we're looking this kind of broader piece that we're doing on the reform programme at the moment and how we're looking at it. And the coverage that our current piece of work has is really all of these boxes, bar the bottom right one on supplier management, which we're partly doing that through the lens of the ICT suppliers. We'll come back to that probably and look in more detail at supplier management across the piece in a year or two. But the piece that we're currently working on covers all of the other areas. It's a very high-level look, and it's a very broad look across the reform agenda. This is broken down into, this is often the way that government looks at its reform agenda. So there's something very much around looking at the landscape and the reforms to the governance and the accountabilities and some of the changes that have been made there. And then there's really largely three headline objectives that they're aiming to achieve through this procurement reform. One is around savings, one is the capability change, and one is growth. So on the slide there, I've just set out the key features that we're focusing on and the key issues that we're dealing with. But then also, we had a separate box on the commercial landscape, and partly that actually reflects the fact that previously in the Efficiency and Reform Group you had procurement here, you had commercial here. As I think Sally said, that's now been combined under Bill Carruthers. So this is really now part of just looking at the landscape overall. So that's really intended to just kind of summarise what we're about now. Apologies that I'm not giving any kind of critical view on the reform programme. That will need to keep powder dry just a little bit on that. But I hope in talking I've got across that for the NAO, procurement is a really critical area. There is a big body of work that we've already done. It will continue to be a big focus of our work without doubt. So on that note, thank you very much.
Yeah, it is. Thank you, Keith. Ladies and gentlemen, before we break for coffee, does anyone have any questions for Keith? He's coming. Lady in the middle there, okay? No, further back. Sorry.
Catherine Wall from Plymouth Business School. We've been looking at recent research that's been undertaken across Europe at the cost of public sector procurement in each country. And it's quite alarming to find that the UK public sector seems to have a much higher cost of procurement than some of our immediate neighbours in Europe, and I think we're in the top 4. Has the NAO done any research into why, for example, the cost of public sector procurement, when you look at buyers and sellers cost, in the UK is more than double that of France? And as our previous speaker said from the FSB, those high procurement costs do present a barrier to small businesses. Has any work been done in that area, and what have you found?
We haven't specifically looked at the data around the cost of procurement in the UK relative to other countries. I mean, we're aware that there's quite a bit of other research that's been done around that. I think it's probably the case that some of the numbers around this need to be treated with caution, I suspect. We need to think about the reliability of some of the research properly. But I think the underlying problem, I think, that you're talking about is real and is there. And certainly our work has looked at different aspects of the procurement process and how there will be elements of waste. I mean, I think we saw it through the lens very much of what I'm talking about, the fragmented landscape and the kind of confusion of roles and responsibilities. Because for us, that creates a lot of waste, a lot of unnecessary work for the procurement team. So, you know, for us, we kind of recommended that the key thing to do is to clean up that landscape, and from that, better behaviours will follow in terms of making sure that we've got the most streamlined process possible, that we're really clear that if we're asking procurement teams and individual bodies to go through steps, that we're really clear those are necessary. That's the way in which we've looked at it. Okay.
Matthew Walton, Rickaby's solicitors. I just wanted to touch on your comments on contract management, because certainly that's my experience of working with local authorities. That's where a lot of long-term projects fall down. Particularly, I think PFI, one of the reasons it's got a bad name is because of the way these contracts are managed. And frequently, sort of 10 or so people within a local authority will set it up and then pass it on to one person who has half a day a week to actually manage it. And the private sector certainly don't take that approach and maximise the advantages. Linking into the skills in the public sector, one of the reasons is that certainly on most of the projects I've been involved in, once it's finished, the public sector head of team has been headhunted by the private sector, moved out of the public sector, leaving a gap there. So firstly, you know, how can the public sector sort of seek to mitigate this approach? And by skilling people up, it's a horrible phrase, but you make them more attractive to being poached by the private sector. And secondly, is there a role here for the dreaded consultant, most of whom do actually form SMEs themselves, but that does allow some form of consistency and long-term approach to these things, as these people can be involved in projects for a long time and not move on.
I mean, on the second point there first, perhaps, I mean, certainly our work on consultants argued that sometimes there will be a case for using consultants. That's usually going to be linked to where the need for skills is relatively specialist and relatively short term. So I think if it's a set of skills that the public sector is going to need on an ongoing basis. And if it's a role that is going to exist in the public sector on an ongoing basis, like a contract manager for a longer term contract, I think I would generally argue that ought to be filled by a public servant, probably rather than a consultant. I think the place for consultants in my mind is very much bringing them in on a shorter term basis and with specific skill set. I lost my train of thought. Remind me of the first part of your question. Sorry, my head can only cope with one thing at once. Pathetic.
That doesn't seem to go. There we go. Yeah, it was just basically how the public sector can develop these skills and actually get contract management in place that genuinely can match the private sector in achieving value.
And the point I wanted to make was the risk of losing the key people to the private sector at the point when it moves into the contract management phase. You can't prevent that. Sometimes that's going to happen. But is the public sector organisation, is the board of that organisation thinking about the risks of that? Does it have a strategy for how it's going to retain commercial expertise, how it's going to create the right environment for commercial expertise to want to stay? So maybe part of it's back to making sure there is the right amount of autonomy for any skilled people you're bringing in. Maybe part of it is about the board of that organisation showing that actually contract management is really important to us. We value your expertise now that we're moving into the contract management phase, and making the person feel that they're valued and they have a real meaningful role with some real autonomy to do things. I don't know whether that many public sector organisations think like that, but you can't prevent it. Sometimes.
Hi, I'm Barry Muller. I'm the next speaker, actually, so this is an advert for me. In my presentation, I'm going to specifically answer that very question you've asked, so please don't leave after coffee. Thank you.
Ricky Turner from the Department for Work and Pensions. I work in the IT department in an operational function, and quite a lot of the issues that we have are as a result of our commercial teams not having an operational understanding of what we do, leading to inefficiencies in contracts, and conversely, a lack of commercial knowledge within the operational teams that has sort of similar implications. Have you done any work, or are you planning to do any work on or analysis on that issue?
We haven't really, to be honest. I kind of recognise the issue, particularly with a very big department like yours. I guess there's bound to be an element, a natural tendency to be a little bit siloed. I recognise the problem. We haven't really tried to do any analysis of how teams can work better internally. But I suspect the issue you raise is one that lots of organisations should be trying to deal with.
Ladies and gentlemen, any last question before we go for coffee? That was an encouragement, wasn't it? Keith, I do like this stage is interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, Keith, thank you very much indeed.